Snow clung to the gravel shoulder as a deputy lifted yellow tape, the flashlight beam pausing on frost-darkened fabric near the culvert, breath fogging the air, radio silent, notebooks unopened. Because everyone understood that December had given up something it meant to keep buried beneath County Road, salt-stained darkness waiting. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Illinois in 1992 was already heavy with winter when the discovery forced itself into the public record. A season when small towns measured time by church calendars, high school basketball schedules, and the slow approach of Christmas. The victim was identified within hours as Emily Larson, 22 years old, a recent community college graduate who worked part-time at a print shop off Main Street and still lived in the upstairs of her parents' farmhouse outside town. Her name moved quickly from a patrol log to a missing person flyer, then to a typewritten press release that would be photocopied and taped inside grocery stores, diners, and the post office. The location of the discovery, a drainage culvert along Route 16 near the Sangamon County line, was ordinary in the way rural roads always are, familiar to generations of drivers who never imagine they will be remembered for anything at all. Emily Larson had been reported missing 3 days earlier, on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Her mother told deputies she had left the house Friday evening, saying she planned to meet friends to watch holiday lights in Springfield. She never came home. Her car, a white 1986 Ford Escort with rust blooming around the rear wheel wells, was found the next morning in the parking lot of a closed hardware store, unlocked, purse still inside. The keys were missing. That detail would matter later, though in the early hours it simply added to the unease spreading through the sheriff's office as they assembled timelines on yellow legal pads and pinned maps to corkboards. The autopsy, conducted at the county medical examiner's office in a building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, revealed no sensational details, only the quiet truths that cold cases are built upon. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window late Friday night. Exposure to cold had altered certain markers, complicating precision, but there were no signs of prolonged struggle at the scene. Fibers were collected. Soil samples were logged. Fingernail scrapings were preserved in small envelopes that would sit for years in a temperature-controlled evidence room, waiting for technology to catch up with intent. December pressed forward regardless. Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows even as local newspapers ran Emily's photograph above the fold, her dark hair pulled back, her smile steady and unremarkable in the way that makes absence feel unreal. Candlelight vigils were held in the town square. Older men, the kind who had lived their entire lives in the county and remembered when the road where she was found was still gravel, shook their heads and said it wasn't like this anymore. Deputies worked through Christmas Eve, checking alibis, knocking on doors where televisions glowed with holiday programming. The case file grew heavier, its manila cover bending under the weight of reports. Investigators reconstructed Emily's last known movements with methodical care. Witness interviews placed her at the print shop until early afternoon Friday, then at a gas station just after sunset. A cashier remembered selling her coffee. A receipt timestamped 6:47 p.m. became a fixed point in the narrative. After that, the trail dissolved into inference. No confirmed sightings. No phone calls. In 1992, cell phones were rare, and Emily did not have one. Her answering machine tape, listened to repeatedly by detectives and family alike, contained nothing unusual, only the hum of a quiet house. Attention turned to the hardware store parking lot. Tire impressions were photographed and cast, though the lot had been plowed after a light snowfall blurring detail. A partial shoe print near the driver's side door suggested someone else had been present, but the pattern was common. The store's owner provided surveillance footage that amounted to little more than grainy shadows. Still, it was logged, labeled, and stored, another fragment in a growing mosaic that refused to resolve. The first year ended without an arrest. Thanksgiving returned, then Christmas, then New Year's, each holiday reopening the wound for Emily's family and for a community unused to unresolved violence. The sheriff at the time held a press conference in January 1993, standing stiffly before microphones, assuring the public the case remained active. It did, though active often meant waiting. Tips came in sporadically, many from well-meaning citizens recalling suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar faces months too late to verify. Each was written down, assigned a number, and investigated to the extent possible. By the mid-1990s, the file had moved from the active shelf to the cold case cabinet, a metal drawer that squealed when opened. Detectives retired, deputies transferred. Emily Larson's name remained, typed on the spine, fading slightly as ink does. Her parents aged. The farmhouse grew quieter. The print shop closed. Yet the evidence endured, preserved according to protocols that had been learned the hard way over decades of American policing. The turn came not with a dramatic confession, but with science and patience. In 2018, the Illinois State Police began a comprehensive review of unsolved homicides from the late 1980s and early 1990s, focusing on cases with preserved biological material. Emily's file was among them. Advances in DNA analysis made it possible to test samples that had once been considered too degraded. The fingernail scrapings collected in December 1992 and sealed away were sent to a state lab. The process took months. Results were entered into CODIS. At first, there was no match. Investigators persisted. They expanded the search, employing familial DNA techniques that had become lawful and accepted under Illinois guidelines. A partial profile suggested a distant relative in the system, someone arrested years later for an unrelated offense. That connection led detectives to a man named Thomas Reed, who in 1992 had been 27 and lived less than 5 miles from where Emily was found. At the time, Reed worked seasonal construction jobs and had been questioned briefly in the original investigation after a neighbor mentioned seeing his truck near the hardware store parking lot. He provided an alibi, vague, but unchallenged in an era without digital verification. In 2021, Reed was discreetly followed. Investigators collected discarded items from public trash, a coffee cup, a napkin. The DNA matched. A warrant was obtained. Reed was arrested quietly in February, the snow again piled along the same roads that had framed the beginning. The community learned through a short article in the local paper, the headline restrained, the tone cautious. After nearly 3 decades, the case had a name attached. The legal process moved slowly, deliberately. Evidence was re-examined. Old witnesses were re-interviewed, their memories imperfect but still useful. The soil samples matched Reed's former property. Fibers aligned with materials from his truck interior. None of it was theatrical. All of it was sufficient. In the fall of 2023, Reed pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding a trial that would have reopened every detail. He was sentenced to 30 years in state prison, a calculation that accounted for time passed and statutes in effect at the time of the crime. Emily Larson was finally laid to rest again, this time with answers. A small memorial was held near Christmas, the date chosen deliberately not to reclaim the season but to acknowledge it. The sheriff's office closed the file, stamping it solved. The cabinet drawer slid shut. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, men now in their 60s and 70s, the resolution was quiet, almost muted, but real. The road by the culvert remained just a road. December came and went. The truth, long delayed, settled into the record where it would stay. The years between the discovery and the arrest had been marked by accumulation rather than action, a slow layering of paper, tape, and fading recollection that defined how cold cases truly live inside American institutions. Emily Larson's file did not sit untouched. It was opened and closed repeatedly by different hands, each detective leaving subtle fingerprints in the margins through annotations, questions circled in pen, and lines under dates that never lost their significance. For the men tasked with maintaining it, many of whom were already approaching retirement by the early 2000s, the case represented an unfinished sentence, something that resisted conclusion despite its apparent simplicity. The Illinois town itself changed in visible ways. A new bypass redirected traffic away from Main Street. The old courthouse received an addition funded by state grants, its hallways still echoing but now lined with newer filing cabinets. Yet the older records, including Emily's, remained boxed in the climate-controlled archive room in the basement, where fluorescent lights hummed and the air carried the smell of dust and institutional carpet. Every few years, a review cycle mandated by state policy required unsolved homicides to be reassessed. Each time, the same conclusions were reached. No confession, no eyewitness placing a suspect at the scene, no definitive forensic link strong enough to support charges. Emily's parents attended these reviews when invited, sitting quietly across from investigators half their age, listening to summaries they already knew by heart. They never raised their voices. They never demanded timelines. They asked only whether anything new existed. Often, the answer was no. Holidays sharpened the pain. Thanksgiving dinners carried empty chairs. Christmas mornings came with unopened ornaments still bearing Emily's handwriting from years earlier. New Year's Eve marked not celebration but counting. Another year crossed off without resolution. Media attention ebbed and flowed. On milestone anniversaries, the local paper ran retrospective pieces written in careful language, avoiding speculation, quoting retired deputies who spoke in generalities about hope and persistence. Regional television stations occasionally picked up the story during slow news cycles, framing it as part of a broader narrative about unsolved crimes in rural America. For viewers, especially older men who had lived through the early 1990s and remembered when crimes like this felt rarer, the story carried a quiet warning about familiarity and trust. Inside the evidence room, the materials endured. The fingernail scrapings, the fibers, the soil samples were preserved according to standards that had evolved but never invalidated the original work. Chain of custody logs were intact. Labels were legible. The restraint shown at the scene in 1992, the avoidance of contamination, would later prove decisive. It was an example of procedural discipline, paying dividends decades later, though no one involved could have predicted the form it would take. When the Illinois State Police initiated their cold case initiative in the late 2010s, the emphasis was not on dramatic breakthroughs but on systematic reevaluation. Cases were prioritized based on the presence of biological evidence, the condition of that evidence, and the feasibility of modern testing. Emily Larson's case scored high. The decision to reopen it formally was administrative, almost mundane, yet it marked the turning of a page that had been stuck for years. The lab work was slow, governed by backlog and protocol. Technicians documented every step. Samples were thawed, tested, retested. Partial profiles were developed, then expanded. The initial absence of a CODIS match did not discourage investigators, who understood the limitations of the database for crimes committed before widespread DNA collection. Instead, they turned to genealogical analysis, a method that required additional warrants, oversight, and adherence to emerging legal frameworks designed to balance investigative necessity with privacy concerns. The partial familial hit did not produce a name but rather a cluster of possibilities, a branching tree that required old-fashioned police work to prune. Census records were consulted, property tax files were examined, employment histories were reconstructed. One branch led repeatedly back to Thomas Reed. His name, once a footnote in the original file, grew heavier with context. In 1992, Reed had lived alone in a rented trailer near the county line. He owned a pickup truck matching the general description given by a witness who had never been confident enough to insist on it. He had no prior violent record, only minor arrests that did not raise alarms at the time. Investigators revisited Reed's original alibi, documented in a single paragraph from 1992. He had claimed to be home alone watching television. No one had corroborated it. At the time, that was not unusual. In retrospect, it became significant. Detectives interviewed people who had known Reed then, many reluctant, some surprised to be contacted after so long. Memories were imperfect, but patterns emerged. Reed was described as quiet, private, someone who drifted between jobs and kept few close ties. Surveillance in 2021 was conducted with restraint. There was no public interest yet, no desire to alert Reed or the community prematurely. Investigators waited, documenting routines, collecting discarded items only when legally permissible. The DNA match, when confirmed, was treated not as an ending but as a beginning. Corroboration was required. The old evidence was brought back into the light, examined alongside the new findings. Soil analysis linked trace elements from the Culvert area to soil found on Reed's former property, a match made possible by geological consistency, unique to that stretch of county land. Fiber comparison connected material from Emily's clothing to fibers recovered from Reed's truck, which he had sold years earlier, but which had been documented during a traffic stop in 1994. Photographs preserved in an unrelated file. Each connection was modest alone, but together they formed a chain strong enough to hold scrutiny. The arrest was executed without spectacle. Reed was taken into custody at his current residence, a modest house in a neighboring county. There were no cameras present. He did not resist. The booking photo showed a man older, heavier, his expression neutral. For the deputies involved, many of whom had grown up hearing about the case, the moment carried weight but not triumph. It was simply a step completed. Court proceedings unfolded in a manner consistent with the seriousness of the charge and the age of the case. Defense motions challenged the admissibility of genealogical DNA, prompting hearings that drew legal observers but little public attention. The court ruled the methods lawful and properly executed. Witnesses testified about procedures rather than memories. The focus remained on evidence, not narrative. Emily Larson's name returned to the courthouse docket, typed in modern font but carrying the same gravity it had in 1992. Her parents attended the hearings, older now, supported by relatives and community members who remembered the winter when everything changed. When the guilty plea was entered, there was no outburst, no visible release. The acknowledgement itself was sufficient. Sentencing took place near the end of the year, December again asserting its place in the story. The judge spoke of accountability and time, of harm that does not diminish simply because years pass. Reed was led away. The case, at last, moved from unresolved to resolved within the official record. Outside, snow fell lightly on the courthouse steps, the same kind of snow that had fallen on a roadside culvert nearly 30 years earlier. Life in the town continued, marked by the same seasonal rhythms. For those who had followed the case for decades, especially older men who understood patience and record-keeping, the resolution offered something rare in cold casework, a quiet ending grounded in method, law, and persistence, with no embellishment and no mystery left unanswered. After sentencing, the administrative work of closing the case began, a process invisible to the public but essential to how justice is formally recorded. Evidence logs were updated to reflect final disposition. Items once marked for indefinite retention were reclassified, some approved for continued preservation due to historical value, others scheduled for destruction under supervision. The Larson file, which had occupied multiple boxes by then, was consolidated into a final archival package, its contents indexed and digitally scanned. The physical folder, edges worn soft by decades of handling, was sealed and labeled with a final notation indicating resolution by guilty plea. For investigators who had inherited the case rather than begun it, this stage carried a peculiar gravity. Many had studied Emily Larson's photographs, maps, and timelines early in their careers, learning from them as examples of disciplined initial response and long-term evidentiary care. Closing the case meant acknowledging that their relationship to it was over. The work would no longer continue in quiet hours or during mandatory reviews. The questions had answers. The record was complete. The town responded in its own restrained way. There were no parades, no speeches. A short editorial appeared in the local newspaper, written in careful language that emphasized patience, science, and the importance of preserving evidence even when outcomes seemed distant. Letters to the editor followed, mostly from older residents who remembered the winter of 1992 clearly. They wrote about the fear that settled in then, the way doors had been locked earlier, the way parents waited longer for headlights in driveways. They also wrote about relief, not celebratory but steady, that uncertainty had finally been replaced with fact. Emily Larson's family declined most interview requests. When they did speak, it was through a prepared statement read by a family representative, thanking investigators across generations for not letting the case disappear. The statement mentioned holidays specifically, noting how Thanksgiving and Christmas had carried an extra weight for decades, each season reopening unanswered questions. Now, they said, the seasons could pass without that same burden. The loss remained, but the ambiguity did not. From a procedural standpoint, the case became a reference point within Illinois law enforcement circles. Training seminars cited it as an example of how early evidence handling can determine future solvability. The fingernail scrapings, collected without certainty they would ever be useful, were discussed alongside modern DNA breakthroughs. The case illustrated the value of restraint, of documenting rather than assuming, of preserving rather than discarding. It also demonstrated how evolving legal frameworks around genealogical DNA could be applied responsibly, with warrants, oversight, and transparency. For men in their 60s and 70s who followed the case closely, the resolution resonated differently than it might have for younger audiences. Many remembered a time before DNA, before databases, when investigations relied heavily on memory and physical presence. Watching a case from that era reach resolution through modern science reinforced a belief in gradual progress rather than sudden transformation. It validated patience, something that age often teaches more effectively than instruction. Thomas Reed was transferred to a state correctional facility far from the county where the crime occurred. His name disappeared from local news as quickly as it had appeared. There were no appeals filed in the first year, no public statements. The system absorbed him, and life inside the prison followed its own routines, disconnected from the seasonal markers that had framed the crime for so long. For the community, Reed became a fact rather than a figure, a line in a court record rather than a presence. The physical locations associated with the case remained unchanged. The culvert along Route 16 still collected runoff during winter thaws. The hardware store parking lot had been repaved, its original layout altered, erasing subtle markers investigators once studied. The Larson farmhouse stood quietly, its field stretching toward the same horizon. These places did not carry signs or plaques. They were ordinary, which in some ways made the story more unsettling, but also more grounded. As years passed after the resolution, the case receded into local history. It was mentioned occasionally in conversations about how much the town had changed, how crime statistics rose and fell, how technology altered daily life. Younger residents knew it only vaguely, if at all. Older residents remembered it as a dividing line, a moment when assumptions about safety shifted. Now, with the case solved, it became part of a closed chapter rather than an open wound. Within the sheriff's office, a small notation was added to an internal report summarizing the year's accomplishments. One solved cold case. No adjectives, no emphasis. It stood alongside statistics about response times and budget allocations. That understated acknowledgement reflected the institutional culture that had carried the case for so long. Justice was not framed as dramatic but as procedural, something achieved through accumulation rather than revelation. The final impact of the case lay not in courtroom drama or public reaction, but in the quiet reassurance that some questions, even when left unanswered for decades, can eventually be resolved. For the men who followed it from the beginning, who read about it in newspapers folded on kitchen tables during Christmas mornings long past, the conclusion affirmed a belief in record-keeping, patience, and continuity. It suggested that even when time seems to erode clarity, it can also create conditions for truth to emerge. Emily Larson's name remains in public records, attached now to a solved case rather than an unsolved one. That distinction matters in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to feel. It changes how the story is told, how it is remembered, how it rests within the collective memory of a place. The absence that began in December 1992 did not end with an arrest, but the uncertainty did. The file was closed. The questions were answered. The season moved on as it always does, carrying with it the quiet weight of resolution earned slowly, carefully, and without spectacle. In the years following the formal closure, the Emily Larson case settled into a different category of existence, no longer an active investigation but not forgotten either. It became part of the institutional memory of the county, referenced quietly when discussions arose about long-term evidence storage or the importance of revisiting assumptions made in earlier decades. The file was occasionally requested by researchers and journalists studying cold case methodology, always under supervision, always treated as a record rather than a story. For the men who had first read about Emily's disappearance in the winter of 1992, often while balancing their own responsibilities as fathers, husbands, and workers, the resolution carried a reflective weight. Many of them remembered where they were when they first heard the news, the radio playing in a truck cab, the newspaper folded beside a cup of coffee. The case had aged alongside them. Its conclusion felt less like an ending and more like a long-delayed settling of accounts, something overdue but still meaningful. Seasonal markers continued to frame how the case was remembered. Each Thanksgiving brought subtle recollections of the weekend Emily vanished. The last ordinary holiday before her absence reshaped the calendar for her family. Christmas decorations in the town square, once tinged with unease during the early years, eventually returned to simple familiarity. New Year's Day, which had once symbolized another year without answers, now carried no such burden. Time resumed its ordinary rhythm, no longer punctuated by uncertainty. The Larson family's farmhouse changed hands several years after the case was solved. The sale was quiet, handled through a local realtor. New occupants arrived with no direct connection to the history, though neighbors understood what the place represented. That transition marked another subtle shift, a sign that the story was moving fully into the past. The land itself remained unchanged, its fields still responding to weather rather than memory. Law enforcement training programs within the state continued to cite the case, particularly emphasizing the absence of shortcuts in the original investigation. There had been no rush to judgment, no coerced statements, no discarded evidence deemed unimportant at the time. The initial investigators, long retired, were occasionally contacted for commentary. Those who spoke did so with restraint, crediting process rather than instinct. They described how the case had stayed with them, not as a source of frustration, but as a reminder of responsibility. The use of genealogical DNA in the case also influenced policy discussions. Oversight committees reviewed the procedures used, confirming compliance with evolving legal standards. The Larson case became an example of balance, demonstrating that advanced techniques could be applied without compromising civil liberties. This aspect resonated with older audiences particularly, those who valued both progress and restraint, and who remembered periods when investigative excess had undermined public trust. Thomas Reed's incarceration faded from public consciousness. Annual prison transfer lists and routine administrative updates did not attract attention. There were no televised interviews, no memoirs, no attempts to recast the narrative. Reed became another inmate number within the system, his connection to the town effectively severed. The absence of spectacle reinforced the understated nature of the resolution. Justice had occurred without performance. On the anniversary of the sentencing, the sheriff's office held no press event. Instead, a brief internal memo circulated, acknowledging the teamwork involved across departments and decades. It listed names of investigators past and present, some deceased, some retired, some still active. The memo was archived alongside the case file, a final administrative acknowledgement that closure is often collective and incremental. For the community, the solved case altered local folklore. Where once the story had been told with speculation and caution, it was now recounted with clarity. Details were factual, stripped of rumor. The lesson conveyed to younger generations was not one of fear but of patience and persistence. It reinforced the idea that even in small towns, complexity exists, and that answers may take time but are not impossible. The physical evidence from the case, preserved beyond the requirements of law, remained stored in the state archive. It served no further investigative purpose, but stood as a testament to procedural diligence. Each labeled envelope, each logged item, represented decisions made by individuals who could not foresee the future impact of their actions. Their care ensured that when technology advanced, the opportunity for resolution still existed. Emily Larson's name appeared one final time in print during a retrospective feature marking advances in forensic science over 30 years. The article referenced her case briefly, respectfully, noting its resolution and the role of preserved evidence. There were no photographs, no emotional language. It was enough to state the facts. Her story had become part of a broader narrative about how justice evolves. As the town continued to age and renew itself, businesses opened and closed, roads were repaired, and seasons turned as they always had. The case no longer defined the community, but it remained a quiet reference point, a reminder of vulnerability and endurance. For those who had lived through it, particularly older men who valued order and continuity, the resolution affirmed that systems, though imperfect, can function across time. The Larson case ultimately demonstrated that closure does not erase loss but can stabilize memory. It allowed the past to remain in the past, recorded accurately rather than speculated upon. The uncertainty that once hovered over every holiday gathering dissipated, replaced by a settled understanding. The investigation ended not with applause but with documentation, not with spectacle but with confirmation. In that sense, the story reached its natural conclusion. A young woman's life, interrupted in December 1992, was honored not through dramatization but through careful work carried forward across decades. The arrest, conviction, and aftermath followed the law as written and practiced. The record stands complete. The seasons continue. The case remains solved, its quiet resolution woven into the fabric of a town that learned, waited, and finally received answers. By the time the final documents were signed and the last procedural reviews completed, the Illinois winter had returned once more, carrying with it the same muted stillness that had defined the cases beginning decades earlier. Snow traced the edges of familiar roads, courthouse steps gathered thin layers of ice, and holiday lights appeared again in windows along Main Street. This time, however, the season passed without unanswered questions trailing behind it, without the quiet dread that once accompanied every December reference to Emily Larson's name. The completed case file now existed in two forms, physical and digital, each reflecting the same conclusion. The narrative no longer ended with uncertainty or speculation. It ended with dates, lab results, warrants, and a lawful conviction entered into the state record. For the institutions involved, this distinction mattered. A solved case carries different weight, different responsibility, and different meaning than one left unresolved. It signals not success, but completion. For those who had followed the investigation since the early 1990s, especially men who had aged alongside the case, the resolution offered a moment of reckoning with time itself. Many had seen careers begin and end, factories close, children grow, and communities change, while Emily's name remained frozen in a specific year. Watching the case finally conclude underscored how slowly justice can move, and how dependent it is on consistency rather than urgency. The methods that ultimately resolved the case were not available when Emily was killed. DNA databases were limited. Genetic genealogy was unimaginable. Yet the foundation laid by the original investigators allowed later generations to succeed where earlier ones could not. That continuity, spanning decades, became the defining feature of the story. It demonstrated how law enforcement functions not as a single moment of action, but as an extended chain of responsibility. The final court outcome, recorded without ceremony, reflected this same restraint. The guilty plea, sentence, and incarceration occurred within established legal boundaries. There were no procedural irregularities, no contested appeals that dragged the case back into uncertainty. The system worked as designed, even if it took far longer than anyone would have wished. Emily Larson's name, now officially attached to a solved homicide, returned to a quieter place in public memory. Her photograph no longer circulated on flyers or anniversary broadcasts. Instead, it remained in archives and records, preserved accurately rather than repeatedly re-examined. This shift allowed her story to rest, no longer subject to rumor or conjecture. For the town, the resolution reinforced a sense of closure that had been absent for decades. It did not erase the memory of fear or loss, but it contained it. People no longer spoke of the case in hushed tones or with unfinished sentences. They spoke of it as something that had happened, been investigated, and resolved. That distinction mattered, especially to older residents who valued order and finality. Holidays regained their ordinary character. Thanksgiving returned to being a time of routine gatherings rather than reminders of disappearance. Christmas lights no longer carried an undertone of unresolved tragedy. New Year's arrived without the quiet accounting of another unanswered cycle. Time, which had once felt stalled around the case, resumed its forward motion. Within law enforcement circles, the case remained instructive. It continued to appear in training materials and internal discussions, not as an anomaly but as an example of endurance. The lessons drawn from it were practical rather than philosophical. Preserve evidence. Document thoroughly. Revisit assumptions. Accept that resolution may come from future tools rather than present ones. The physical landscape associated with the case remained unchanged, yet its meaning shifted. The culvert along the rural road was no longer a symbol of mystery, but a location with a documented history. The parking lot where Emily's car was found was simply a repaved space serving a different business. These places returned to anonymity, their significance absorbed into the broader geography of the county. Thomas Reed's role in the story diminished as well. Once identified, charged, and convicted, he receded into the background of the correctional system. His name remained in court records, but not in conversation. The focus returned to process rather than personality, reinforcing the principle that justice is about actions and evidence, not notoriety. The quiet aftermath of the case defined its final chapter. There were no lingering investigations, no unresolved leads, no pending questions. The closure was complete, not because every emotional wound healed, but because the facts were settled. For those who had lived with uncertainty for years, that clarity carried its own form of peace. Emily Larson's life, interrupted at 22, could not be restored, but it could be honored through accuracy and restraint. Her case demonstrated that even when time stretches beyond expectation, accountability can still be achieved. The decades between crime and conviction did not diminish responsibility. They tested it. As winter gave way to spring in the years following the resolution, the town continued as it always had. Crops were planted, roads were repaired, new families arrived, old ones moved on. The case no longer defined the community, but it remained part of its history, recorded cleanly and truthfully. In the end, the Illinois 1992 cold case reached its conclusion not with drama, but with documentation. The arrest shocked the community briefly, then settled into understanding. The conviction closed the record. The aftermath was quiet, lawful, and final. The story stands complete, a testament to patience, procedure, and the long arc of justice carried forward through winter after winter until it finally arrived.